Well, it's November 23rd, 2022. Welcome to the Trainer's Bullpen. This is where trainers in the law enforcement sphere come to hear experts talk about their work, their experience, and their research into human performance, particularly as it relates to the critical aspects of training motor learning and decision-making. The purpose of the Trainer's Bullpen is to help bridge the gap between law enforcement training and the findings of academic research and current pedagogical best practices. Our desire here at the Trainer's Bullpen is to help advance law enforcement training to make research applied and improve officer and public safety. The Trainer's Bullpen is a production of Raptor Protection, and I'm Chris Butler, your host for today. And it's my pleasure to welcome to the show Dr. Paula Di Nota. Dr. Di Nota received her PhD in psychology from York University in 2017, specializing in brain, behavior, and cognitive sciences. Using multiple neuroimaging techniques and behavioral experiments, Paula's research showed how training and expertise shape brain activity and impact performance. As a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto, Paula's current research focuses on complex relationships between stress, learning, performance, resilience, and health in police. She's trained and evaluated frontline, tactical, and military personnel from across Canada and Europe. Her ongoing collaborations with the Police University College of Finland identify effective educational practices for situational awareness and lethal force decision-making. Paula is also a member of the CIPSRT, a national research consortium that aims to support wellness and functioning in police and other public safety personnel. Paula's interdisciplinary research is published in top peer-reviewed journals in cognitive psychology, policing, and occupational health, and has been translated into actionable policy recommendations for evidence-based police education. Well, Dr. Di Nota, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the Trainer's Bullpen. Thank you for making the time to be with us here today.
Absolutely, Chris. Thank you so much for inviting me and having me.
So when I reached out and contacted you, or the reason that I did is, of course, I love to read research that people are doing in the law enforcement space, or that can help law enforcement trainers. And one of the papers I read was one that you and a co-author published in Frontiers in Psychology. This was in August of 2019, called Complex Motor Learning and Police Training, Applied Cognitive and Clinical Perspectives. So, Paula, we're going to get into a lot of critical issues in this paper that you kind of talk about that can really help advance law enforcement training. But first, why don't you tell us, like, why did you choose this topic, and why was it important to you?
That's a great question. So the kind of birth of that paper, the origins of that paper, really lie in my my PhD dissertation work, which in and of itself, like the individual chapters have been published as different studies, but kind of putting the information all together, it wasn't really well known. It wasn't really anywhere. And coming from a neuroscience background and starting in a research lab, so at the University of Toronto, working with Dr. Judith Anderson. She's a health psychologist. She's been studying police for well over a decade. I started seeing kind of commonalities and also gaps in knowledge in the policing field, or for neuroscience and understanding learning and training and stress and how that specifically relates in police. It wasn't really empirically studied. So really the motivation for that article was to kind of put information all in one place as a starting point for identifying gaps in knowledge. What do we need to do next? What do we know? What don't we know? And really critical to adding the police perspective from that is my co-authors, Chief Inspector Juha-Matti Huhta. So he's a use of force and tactics and stress management instructor at the Police University College of Finland. Has over 20 years of operational experience in special units and canine and tactical units, and over 10 years as an instructor, and also has a master's and currently pursuing a PhD in education. So in terms of the pedagogy and how do we actually train these skills and embed them in the brain in a way that very uniquely to police, also a lot of these skills they need to be recalled and performed accurately under very, very high levels of stress. So it's not just the ordinary learning sitting in a classroom and, passively learning something. Because from what I know about the brain and the body and what happens under stress, that's not going to work. And the research says the same thing. So again, the real aim of that paper was to combine as many perspectives as possible to speak to learning and training and motor performance in a police specific context.
Okay, and so the topics that you talk about in your paper, did you select those because in your experience as a researcher, you feel that those are the critical components that can really help improve motor learning in law enforcement?
Yeah, so by understanding kind of the fundamentals, the basic principles of how your brain learns, and specifically motor behavior, that is what I focused on in my PhD. So complex movements, coordinated body movements. Truth be told, my PhD research looked at ballet dancers, which you would think, well, what do they have to do with cops? But the more I've come into working with police officers, since 2017, I learned that it's actually quite similar. There's very little margin for error. You have to be very precise and exact in your movements. There's very rigorous training schedules. So, especially for tactical officers, you're constantly training, even when you're not on calls, and running through scenarios and simulations and practice, practice, practice. So, how that rewires the brain is very similar to ballet dancers. And anecdotally, in some of my training experience with cops and seeing them do the scenarios, especially when they're in teams, and watching how they move like very silently and very coordinated, and they're literally operating as like one brain. The word that comes to my mind is graceful. It's actually like so impressive to watch how police are able to navigate and being kind of on that side, like behind the blue line, so to speak, and seeing how training actually happens and the level of performance that officers actually have has been really rewarding as well. Like just as a civilian, as a researcher, and an appreciation for the amount of stress and the physical, psychological stress that the work and the training induce in police officers. You cannot separate that from motor learning and motor performance. So that's where that piece also comes in the research article, because these things in science are studied in separation. Like motor learning, how does that happen? You do it in a laboratory and examine how that works. Stress, we look at that separately, measure it in a laboratory. How does that work? But that's not how policing works. That's not the reality of it. Everything is messy. Everything comes together. There's real life context and individual characteristics and personality and things like that, which for scientists they don't like. It's messy, but at the same time it's real life. Like this is the reality of in an applied setting. So that's where the applied focus comes in. So scientifically that just means like what is the practical application of this knowledge. And then that's what I do now as a researcher. So working with police, seeing what their training curriculums and things look like, and then trying to apply the science and the research that I know to whether that's effective or not, or how can we improve that, with different evidence-based strategies and methods, things like that.
Okay, great. So, I think you said something really important there about because in law enforcement, what often happens, and you're undoubtedly aware of this, especially in the academy setting, is we spend a lot of our time focused on motor skill training, so like basic motor skill training, and a lot of that time does not include the embedding of the performance of those skills within a situational task relevant type of environment. And you mentioned this on page 2 of your paper. You say situational awareness and decision making are essential motor skills for policing that integrate sensory, motor, and cognitive functions. So, maybe unpack that a little bit for us. What's the role of situational awareness and decision making in motor learning?
Mm-hmm. So that's this again is all of what I have learned has been from Chief Inspector Huchta. So I hope we do have a follow-up session here with him to explain that further, because that's really his passion, what he is studying again for his own PhD right now, and the appreciation that I gained from that, from hearing his side from an instructor perspective, is that every encounter starts off with situational awareness. You're assessing the situation, but and that being the finite definition of it, maybe we can unpack that a little bit more. But in terms of what that initial assessment informs is everything that happens subsequently, every decision that an officer makes, every a cue that they pick up on, and how that informs their judgment and assessment and their behavior, then like where they position themselves, what force option they might use, or what they would say to an individual. Like it all starts from that first step. So in terms of coordinating like the cognitive, motor, physical skills, like I said, so cognition is just a fancy word for thinking, different thinking processes, like reasoning, assessment, inhibition, so not saying or doing something that you would otherwise reflexively want to do. Like that involves a lot of brain power, a huge amount of thinking and complex cognition. So that's all that means. So all of these different skills and processes come into play, and are directly informed by situational awareness. Like what you see and what you perceive in a scene is directly going to inform the level of threat that you perceive, your stress level in particular might be kicked up. You now see a gun on the table, that indicates something to you, and is directly going to inform then the motor skills. So the motor plan of where should I move, where should I go, how should I move, how quickly and how strong do I have to be right now. So that those are other processes again that are planned in the brain. Different parts of the brain are responsible for these processes. They speak to each other in milliseconds, and as an officer yourself, Chris, I'm sure you know things happen in seconds. So understanding kind of the neuroscience behind these processes is essential for teaching them effectively and then performing them effectively in the real world, because you don't have time to stop and think and deliberate and what should I do? No, there isn't time. You have to know very quickly and very dynamically what to do and how to change that as the situation continues to unfold. Because again, situational awareness isn't just step one and done. You're constantly reassessing, because even as you move through the space, things are changing. So constantly updating, and going through all of these mental processes over and over again.
That's great, Paul. And in the situational awareness, and I know you said we want to unpack that more, and I think it's good we do. We can do that now or later when you do your screen share. But one of the things that we will often hear law enforcement trainers use that phrase of situational awareness. They'll talk and they'll say it like, well, you need to be situationally aware. You lost situational awareness. But I've not heard, we have, like, what does that mean to a trainer, right? And so I think that's part of the problem, because there's this notion that, for great performance, you need to have this almost Jedi-like awareness of everything that's going on. But that's not what we see, is it? Like when you look at great performers, elite level performers, whether that's in sporting or in law enforcement, that's not at all what they're doing. Their situational awarenesses, they are actually searching for those critical cues, because they have the game intelligence to understand what's likely going to happen, and when it does, where's it going to occur, and what's it going to look like when it does. So I think that's really important that you do talk to us about that from a sort of a psychological, neurological perspective, because we really need trainers to understand, like, what do we mean by situational awareness, and then how do we train it?
Yeah.
So did you want to talk about that now, Paula, or do you want to wait till
Yeah, sure. We can dive into that too. So so as I mentioned in the 2019 article, there isn't a good definition of situational awareness. So exactly like you said, like what does that actually mean? Not to be situationally aware. Well, sure, that's really great, but what does it mean? What some officers and in the research literature anyways, the way that it's been typically defined up until recently, and the recent work that Juha Matti and I have been doing, that I will share, I'm really excited to share with you, is a model like in the mid 90s by Mika Ensley. She developed, and this isn't for specific for policing either, I should mention. So that's really important to clarify that just in general, situational awareness, kind of used interchangeably, was typically thought as this very linear process. So starting off with perception, what do you see in your environment, or also hear, smell, feel, all of those things, all of your sensory perception, then understanding that information and comparing that to your memory, to your past experiences, to your past training of what might this mean? I see this guy with his hand behind his back. What might that mean? And then the final step is kind of this cognitive process of prediction. So, starting to create and running through this very, very quickly, again, in milliseconds. Okay, what might that mean? Well, maybe he's got something. Maybe now I need to adjust my behavior and move back, or find cover or something, or start asking him to show his hands, so on. So again, this is the established model that existed before, doesn't speak to the complexity of police decision making and situations and all kinds of other factors. And it also is quite linear. There's no reappraisal process kind of reflected here. So with Juha Matti, we were really, well, he was really interested specifically in finding out, what are the elements that specifically define situational awareness in these police specific contexts, and looking at experts. So starting off with the experts, as you mentioned, like they know kind of where to look and what cues to pick up on. So we really focused on studying them and specifically their eye movements. So using eye tracking, where do they look in different scenes, and also interviewing them, and what does that actually mean in terms of tactical decision making. So we published a study earlier this year on the eye tracking component of this study that he ran over in Finland. So sitting at a computer, he had expert and novice police officers look at 13 different pictures of different staged images, staged encounters that vary from non-threatening to highly threatening. And we measured their eye movements, so where they're stopping and fixating and looking, and where their eyes are tracking, moving around for about 15 seconds. And then they were asked a question afterwards. So what did you see, and what would you have done next? And based on the transcripts from all of these interviews with novice and expert police officers, we were able to analyze and extract different themes and concrete themes of what situational awareness actually means. And so they repeated this again for about 13 different images. And just to show you quickly kind of what we did for each of the pictures, we kind of looked at different target regions of interest. So that's ROI. So, marked boundary regions around specific target areas in each picture to see how long and whether their eyes landed within these areas versus the surrounding environment. And we're also specifically interested in some of these sub-regions of interest. So heads, faces, hands, things like that, as those might be really important visual cues. So this is just a neat picture of kind of what the eye tracking data looks like. We see actual blobs, and these represent spots of where officers' eyes actually looked. So really using cutting edge neuroscientific evidence, as these are implicit eye movements. Like officers are not really consciously deliberately trying to look anywhere. We were really looking, and we also looked at the first 5 seconds, so very early fixation patterns, like where are the eyes darting around and looking and stopping on, and what information are they deriving. So a couple of the key findings that we found was that the expert officers, who all had at least 15 years of experience, operational experience, and in tactical units, K9 special units, as well as some police instructors, some use of force and tactics instructors as well. They all tended to look at the hands earlier in their search patterns compared to the face. And that's really important as well for rookies to understand that the hands are what can reach for things and might cause harm and do some damage. So already just that finding can really inform situational awareness training, tactical use of force training, to teach rookies to look to the hands earlier. everyone tended to look at the face first, which, that provides important social cues and social information, emotional information, possibly on the person's like mental health status as well. If someone kind of, looks like to be in a state of delirium, there's a lot of information that comes from the face. So that's great that everyone has that primitive kind of response. But what the experts, again, tend to do is focus on the hands and also focus more on the target compared to the environment. And that's what we found with the rookies, with the novices. So these are all trainees at the Police University College of Finland. So before any practical field experience, they participated in the study, and they tended to scan, look around in the room a lot more than focusing on the person and deriving important information and cues about them. But that following their tactical training, we kind of split our novice group into two, and found that after their tactical use of force training, the novices did start to look to the hands earlier. So, there's evidence to suggest that practical training, directed training, already starts to shape these kind of automatic visual motor behaviors. So visual motor being like, where do your eyes look? Where do the muscles and in your eyes direct them to look? So that's really neat research that wasn't in the 2019 paper because it didn't exist. So we were able to kind of come up with this. And then to break down the interview data, these were the 7 different themes that we were able to identify from the interview. So what does situational awareness actually mean? So based on what officers said to what they saw and what they would do next, a lot of them identified different tactical options and opportunities. Like, okay, the guy's in the doorway, I would position myself here or there. So, and again, most of these responses came from experts. Novices didn't really have much to say, understandably. But experts had a really great idea for how what they saw translated into where they should be, how they should position themselves. And really critically, what we saw, especially from the instructors in our expert group, was this constant sense of self-awareness. So an ongoing assessment of how their own activities, how their own positioning and tactical maneuvers would inform their situational awareness. And that's really key. And what I touched on before in this constant reappraisal, in the sense that as you move through the scene, the expert officers are really keen in understanding, okay, now where I've positioned myself or the verbal command that I've just given, how is that going to impact the situation as it continues to unfold? So this was a really key and novel theme that we found. In addition to some of the more practical, fundamental things like understanding distance and time laws. So how far are you relative to a person? In terms of time laws, meaning how long or how fast can I get to that person, or can they get to me? And that's going to adjust your tactical options and opportunities. So again, these themes are really heavily interrelated as well, and tend to inform each other. So some of the more obvious things being, the presence of dangerous objects, which novices were able to spot. Okay, there's a gun on the table, but they weren't able to connect that to distance and time, how much time it might give them to arrive at that, or how might that inform their tactical options and opportunities, right? That's where the expert level comes in. And like you said, kind of putting the pieces together and identifying even the potential for dangerous objects. Well, there might be something in that other room or in the kitchen, and I would go look there. So, and profiling the suspect, meaning, not just sizing them up and, oh, they look aggressive or they look angry. But what the experts were able to do is look at, another theme like the surrounding environment and conditions, say, okay, this place looks pretty neat and tidy. So, that doesn't seem to imply that this person might be dangerous or chaotic or in a bad mind state. So maybe there isn't anything too dangerous going on, or vice versa. This place is a total mess and I see things all over the place. So this person might, be in some sort of a crisis, or looks like there's something bad going on here. So again, demonstrating kind of the interrelatability of the different themes. And lastly, understanding partners and roles, which is also really critical. And we see this in incident command response, and knowing who's the primary officer, who's secondary, who's got the support role, and what does that entail for you. So okay, if someone else is taking the lead, then what are my tactical options and opportunities? Should I switch to a less lethal force and kind of stand back or provide cover or do other things? So all of these are very practical and concrete aspects and elements that together comprise situational awareness. And what we're really proud of and what we're really hoping for this study, when hopefully it comes out soon, is to be able to provide police trainers with concrete manageable steps and different chunks that can then be taught as part of a toolkit, part of your skill set in developing a better sense of a broader situational awareness and defining it in a more understandable way that has really meaningful components that can also be specifically focused on in training and different training exercises as well.
Okay, that's excellent. Thank you for that overview. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I don't know that many of the viewers will be familiar with eye tracking technology. So can you just tell us, like, the eye trackers, what do they do? What part of vision do they tell you is being used?
Yeah,
And what do they inform you as to what the performer is actually attending to?
for sure. So eye trackers are becoming a lot more sophisticated in the sense that they're not as invasive. Before you would have to sit in front of a camera that literally tracks the black pupil part of your eye and you couldn't move at all. But I believe the system that they used for this study over in Finland was just a set of glasses that you put on, and it's got two little tiny cameras on it that again it just locks onto your pupil and tracks it according to whatever it is that you're looking at. So whether it's participating in a live scene or something more controllable, like the paradigm that we use, just looking at static images, static pictures, and the software system of the eye tracker literally will track the order of your fixation. Where do you look next? How long do you stop and look at something? Oops, sorry. And if you consider our eye movements and where they kind of jerk around and look around every second, they reveal a lot about kind of your unconscious mind and where you're looking, because what you see and what we actually found in the study, especially with the novices, what you see, meaning where your eye actually lands, doesn't actually translate to what you consciously see or perceive. So in some of these pictures, like with the guy in the kitchen, there is a gun here on the table, but in some of the cases in the interview that followed, the participants didn't say anything about a gun. They didn't even mention it. And this wasn't even a stressful task. Like you would expect to see kind of those lapses in memory when, things are really, really stressful and, the officer may or may not have encoded or remembered something happening. But in a non-stressful passive viewing task, it was so amazing for us to be like, well, there's something really obvious and visually salient here. We know objectively that your eye landed on that thing. So how can you not remember it? Why didn't you remember it or think that it might have been an important piece of information? So that's again just really telling and revealing to us about like what's happening in the brain. How do we piece these pieces of information together? And that eye tracking is a really useful tool again in being able to capture some of these unconscious automatic things, because the way that your eyes are wired to look is within like micro milliseconds. Like there are things called microsaccades that your eyes move so quickly, but your brain fills in the information so that if you look from side to side, you don't get nauseous and feel like your whole world is moving. Like our visual systems, that's the strongest sense we have. That's my specialty in visual neuroscience too, so I could geek out on the technicalities of visual perception for days. But it's really incredible what our visual system provides, but how there can also be such a disconnect with what you consciously perceive, even though if your eyes are looking at it and you're still not getting it or not piecing it together or consciously remembering it. That's very possible, and it's also very natural too. So I also don't want to make it seem like, oh, cops are not good at doing this. Like human beings are generally not good at doing this. And the stress responses that we were kind of alluding to at the very beginning, again, like these are fundamental, universal human responses that a lot of times cops are, they seem to be punished or looked down upon because they can't operate within these literally impossible conditions sometimes, or why their brain or eyes don't do this certain thing under stress. Well, it's because our human system has limitations and doesn't operate that way under stress. So using tools like this, and my past research that use brain imaging techniques to really look inside the brain to see what's happening, a lot that hasn't yet been done in police. I'm hoping that my future research can really get more into that neural imaging, but this is a really great start. And there are a lot of growing number of studies that do use eye tracking, because again, it's becoming simplified. A pair of glasses that you can just pop on and calibrate, and it will tell you a lot about where an officer's eyes are moving. And then using other types of methods like questionnaires and interviews to put those pieces together and see, okay, what you see, does that translate to actually what you're consciously perceiving and informing situational awareness, decision making, and everything that comes after that.
Okay, so one of the things with that, so you mentioned that sometimes officers can, just because their eye scans land on salient cues in the environment, but there's no sort of cognitive processing about what that actually means. Did you see a difference between the sort of the novices and the experts in your eye tracking study? Like, did the experts, were they faster to pick up on those relevant cues, and did they understand the significance of them quicker than the novices, or what did you see there?
Yeah, definitely. So that's why we were interested in the order of the fixation. Like, what do you look at first? What do you look at second, third, fourth, fifth? And really, just those first 5 to 6 fixations is what we were measuring specifically. And that's what we see here. And it's kind of tough to see, but there are little numbers within each of these circles. So the system literally gave us that information. And the different colors are just different participants, and the size of the circle represents the time of fixation. So the longer they spent looking at a certain spot here, the bigger that circle grew. So just to give you some context on what this colorful blob picture actually means. So once again, the experts we found within the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fixations, they're moving around the space, but going back to the target, looking at their hands, focusing more on that person, and then combined with the qualitative interviews after, providing a much more multidimensional response. Like, even in one sentence, they could touch on multiple of these themes. Like, okay, so I saw a gun on the table that was a bit too far for me to get to, so and the guy didn't seem to be too threatening, so instead I did this, and if that didn't work, I would then do, something else. So really bouncing around and providing a rich set of information that they had no idea what the purpose of this study was, and that we were looking for different components of situational awareness. So just through their expertise and in describing what they would naturally do and going through that thought process, we were able to analyze that and break that down to identify these specific components, and really break them down into these concrete things to derive that tacit knowledge. So tacit meaning, like, it's just implicit, it's inherent. You can't even really describe it. You can't even articulate it and put it into words. And that's what we see a lot with expertise, and some of the research, like by Gary Klein and some other people that you're familiar with their work as well. Our brains are just so good at detecting patterns and knowing what to do and being able to figure out what to do, but explaining that and actually putting that into words, it can sometimes be really tough. So like you said, as police instructors can sometimes say, okay, you just have to be situationally aware. Like, what does it mean? What does that actually mean? Like, pulling those words out can be really challenging. And what we found also from the interviews, that the experts that were police instructors were particularly good at articulating and explaining what they would do next, and touching on each of these different themes, and especially this ongoing assessment, like the self-awareness of, well, if I do this, it might lead the suspect to do this, so then I would also have this backup plan. And that shows again, like the highest level of sophistication and of thinking, of really predicting and thinking what might happen next, and how already in your mind, you've already programmed a contingency plan. So like you just said, that's what the highest level athletes do. And situational awareness is something that's really fundamental also in other domains like athletics, military, aviation as well, like needing to not only be aware of the environment around you, but how you influence that environment, and your behavior now changes it and needs to constantly be updated.
Well, you know what? This is amazing. And what I think is so going to be so exciting for, I can't wait till this paper is published.
Me too.
Because what I'm seeing here and what you're talking about is being able to codify the performance elements that high performers, that the elite officers do, but we can now bring those into the academy at the very early stages of training and start building drills and scenarios to integrate the critical aspects of situational awareness. And it could be really powerful to help improve our officers' training.
That's exactly the intended goal of this study and of all of the research. And I'm really proud to say that that our partners there at the Police University College of Finland, they're starting to do that already. And they were able to do that with other training paradigms that we've developed, in collaboration with academics, scientists, clinicians, and police practitioners, so that everyone is bringing something to the table. The police instructors and their operational experience, they know what's happening, and in the situation, what the essential elements are. So by making that explicit now and investigating it using, neuroscientific tools and, thematic analyses of interview data, like we're really extracting this expert information, because obviously that's what we want to build. We want to build expertise. You want to do it faster, you want to do it safer, more effectively. So exactly like you said, we're hoping that the article, once published, we've provided really clear definitions and descriptions and examples of what each of these themes mean, suggestions for different training exercises. How can you bring each of these elements in? Or when you're designing, whether it's a scenario like a real live scenario, or even other more simple training tasks, how can you touch on each of these elements to, kind of build that fundamental knowledge, and then step up the complexity, step up the dynamic nature of the scenario that's going to involve now combining these things and really building that next level expertise.
And I think what you just said there, Doctor, is really critical for trainers, because we need, and I guess, maybe is this where part of the art of training comes in? Because as we look at, that scaffolding approach of increasing the complexity and the desirable difficulties of challenges, we don't want to overwhelm our performer, because, well, maybe you can talk to us, like, what's the relationship then between like pressure and stress? So as an officer, if I'm going through a scenario and I need to maintain great situational awareness, and that is defined by all those categories that you just mentioned, then what's the relationship between my physiology and my anxiety and stress level on situational awareness? Has that been studied, and is it well understood?
That's great. So I think I jumped the gun a little bit. So we've published this in terms of different training method approaches. So as we were just talking about, as your complexity increases, and sort of your level of training also, you start off as the green rookie, and all the way to the experienced guys that also need to update their knowledge and learn new skills. And as policies and things change, or as information and knowledge changes, we find better ways of doing things, and better ways of defining things, like situational awareness. So all of that can be met with different types of training methods. So this is from a book chapter that we published, and again, if anyone is interested in actually getting this information, if you're having a hard time getting to the actual articles themselves and things like that, I can give you my email address to pop up, and officers can definitely reach out to me. I'm happy to answer questions, or provide some of these resources. But what we've found that, starting off with observational learning, so this is the no stress situation, you're learning the basics. This is good for refresher training and experts. Like, you don't necessarily need to go through the full live stressful scenario-based training. That's the most dynamic, most complex. But everything in between, there are different strategies that we can use that, again, also leverage your training resources. So maybe the biggest lesson that I've learned as an academic and civilian is how finite that training time is. The officer's first priority is their calls for service. You're on call. Yes, there are regular training intervals that happen. How frequently and what's trained during that time is a whole other conversation, and how well that's done. But from a teaching perspective, we can also appreciate that, okay, not every teaching condition is ideal with unlimited time and resources to do it the perfect way. So what are some of the different techniques that can result in really effective, short, quick training? So different things like mental imagery or visualization. So if you don't have time to run through an entire scenario, just getting the officers to go through kind of like the thought experiment, the mental simulation. Well, what would you do? That activates certain parts of the brain that are also involved in the physical performance. So what we see a lot in athletes, especially if they're injured or if they're in downtime, they use mental imagery to imagine themselves going through the course, or throwing that free throw, or doing whatever it is, and you're literally rewiring those brain networks almost in the same way as if you were physically practicing it, obviously without the physical reinforcement itself. So imagery and visualization is a really important tool that we've used. And this is also in the 2019 paper, but just to expand on it a bit more, this component skills training. So what that means, sort of, I think trainers have referred to it as kind of box drills, or these really short drills where you're practicing kind of one finite skill. So these new situational awareness themes that we've just identified, those can be used to very easily come up with these sort of component training skills. Like, okay, if you're in this scene and you want the officer or the trainee specifically to focus on like distance and time and their tactical options and opportunities. Well, those are the specific skills and outcomes that you're going to want to look for in this little mini task, and try to get the trainee to arrive at considering those facets, considering those aspects. Or often we see that when training lethal force decision making, like just shoot or no shoot. We're not interested in the physical maneuver of it, but here's a quick situation. What do you do? So that's what we mean by this kind of component skills training, like these little kind of learning of individual steps that can then be built into more complex simulations or scenarios in virtual and in live contexts that now put these things together. And you wouldn't start a rookie off in this highly complex situation. You need to build these foundational blocks using these different methods before you arrive at that. But I want to answer your actual question now. So pairing that with the actual stress response. So from the 2019 paper, we had to, again, bridge the basic science stuff that has looked at rats and monkeys and humans and understanding what happens in your brain, what happens in your body with stress, as stress or pressure, as you said, increases, and combining that with the data that we see in police research on what performance looks like under high stress. And we know that more mistakes are made. We know that there's more freezing, or situational awareness is impaired, but how and what is the mechanism? How does that actually happen? That's still relatively unknown, even from 2019, from when this paper came out. There's still a lot of investigation that needs to be done. So pairing that with the chart that I just showed you, we know that low stress or no stress, that's effective for learning declarative skills. So things like laws and procedures and facts and things that you need to recall. You don't need to be stressed out to learn those things. And in fact, that might actually interfere with your ability to learn those things. But that with moderate levels of stress, like as you see in scenario-based training, it's really important that it simulates real world pressure, real world stress, because you don't want to experience that for the first time when you're actually in the field. You want to train officers to physically feel that arousal, that pressure, and that stress so that they're not only comfortable with it, but know how to effectively manage that and still be able to perform effectively. So stress does play a really critical role in the training process, and it also helps to encode information or really build it into your muscle memory so that it isn't blocked and those skills aren't blocked then when you're in this high stress, when you're kind of in the red line, and stress is extremely high. It's having effects on your brain and on your body. And we see this kind of with this inoculation training or like really militaristic style training where, I think I've heard it referred to as like ninjas dropping from the ceiling. Like you walk into a room and you're just ambushed. So that's a no-win situation as well. Like that's not a really effective training situation because you're not training any skill. There's nothing you could do in that situation. So it's kind of a wasted opportunity. It's wasted time and could potentially result in a training scar. And I think that's something we really want to talk about as well. But that's now introducing stress in a way that's not adaptive. It's not helping anyone learn. It could be potentially damaging. And we know that at these levels of extreme stress, that police performance is impaired, especially without adequate training. So especially without training in these stressful situations, we're sort of setting the officers up for failure or potentially even a trauma, which you don't ever want to do. So again, building up that expertise, starting with no stress, building the fundamentals, gradually increasing complexity of your training tasks to meet these increasing levels of stress to eventually get officers prepared to perform sort of at these high levels, but still maintain that effectiveness.
Okay, so whole bunch of questions coming out of this because I
Yeah.
think really important. The first one is, so I heard you use the word pressure and stress. And now, were you using those synonymously, or do they mean two different things in the research, stress and pressure?
So that's a good question. There's so many terms that are used kind of synonymously, like scenario and simulation, or stress, pressure, unease, threat. Like these are all kind of very much used interchangeably, but um, the common thing about all of those things, stress, pressure, threat, anxiety, if you even want to use that term, is that they all have a similar physiological effect. So, driving up your heart rate, inducing tunnel vision, inducing these kind of perceptual distortions. And these can either be from like real external stressors, like, seeing a gun on the table or being in a dark environment. Within milliseconds, your brain and your body is triggering responses that are meant to be adaptive, like fight or flight. It's meant to help you survive or mobilize or avoid, run away, as we're all programmed to do, and cops are programmed to run into the threat, which is an incredible thing. Thinking from the scientific perspective, you're going counter to evolution and running directly towards the threat. So what does that do then to your physiological system? So what the term that we prefer to use as well in our research group anyways is unease, because that tends to encompass sort of everything. So the pressure of the situation, which might infer sort of the demands of the situation, like as your demands increase and as uncertainty increases, or the potential for danger or violence, that all increases threat, it increases pressure, and it increases this physiological sense of unease. So you feel this, like I think that's why we also like to use the term, because it's something that we're all sort of connected to, and you can't really articulate it. You get a funny feeling in your stomach, you get tightness in your muscles, your mouth goes dry. And again, this unease can be really adaptive at low levels, like me being nervous to give an interview and talk about policing in front of policing experts. But it's good because it brings the blood flow to my brain. It helps me connect information and be vigilant and pay attention, and actually enhances performance. But there's a tipping point somewhere then when especially if there are underlying mental health disorders, which we see elevated rates of in police officers, like anxiety or depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. And especially without training and knowing how to manage these physiological effects, it can start to be kind of like a runaway train and like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, like you don't know what's happening. And that will tip you over the edge from that effective performance to now making mistakes or missing cues in the environment or forgetting what's happening or forgetting your training. Like if it isn't really deeply encoded into your muscle memory, that pressure, that unease and threat, it's completely going to interfere with your ability to access that motor information. And it might result in you doing something reflexive as opposed to what your training tells you you should do. And we see that in experts as well. And Chief Inspector Huchta, he's observed that again in the high level elite guys that have had, decades of training, and they're still making mistakes and making kind of rookie mistakes. So that's what's kind of led to sort of his research questions and something that we've tried to explore a lot in our investigations and understanding the stress continuum, because we know fundamentally this is a very common model of performance and stress, this inverted U that, with some moderate stress, performance increases, but then it starts to drop down. But what specific point or heart rate it starts to decrease, we don't know. And it's also highly individual. An individual between you and me, Chris, an individual on you on a day where you're more tired or you didn't get a great night's sleep, or I had an argument with my husband or something, and now I'm particularly stressed. So my tipping point is now changed, or your immune system's compromised. You're getting over the flu, something like that. So this relationship between stress and performance is so nuanced. There isn't any hard and fast rules, but we do know from these general principles and relationships how we could tailor training to be better suited to meet these demands.
You earlier mentioned about, use the phrase muscle memory, and I think most trainers would know exactly what you mean by that. We're talking about the automaticity or the automation of motor skills, right? And now, when officers are taken to a level of that automaticity with their motor skills, are those skills found to be more resilient under higher stress, or what's the relationship between automaticity and performance under pressure?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. So as we learn, I don't think I have a slide or a picture for that, but definitely as you learn something, it becomes more automatic, and that's sort of a hallmark of expertise as well. Is that not only do you become more accurate and quicker and more fluid in your performance, but you're also able to then dynamically apply that skill in different contexts. So I don't know, I like to use sports examples. Like if someone becomes perfect at throwing a free throw, like from the foul line, okay, you can do this perfectly now. Well, then your next stage of training would now be to be able to throw to the basket from different positions. Once you've accomplished that, now you want to have an opponent in front of you, maybe two or three. So again, increasing the complexity, increasing the level of stress and demands that need to be met. That's how you train and build that expertise. So it's not only that the movements have to become automatic, but they need to be able to be applied in a variety of situations. So in thinking of situational awareness, for instance, starting off in the classroom, looking at pictures and training the rookies. Okay, what are the specific components, and really understanding that. You have to have that implicit understanding before you can start to put the pieces together. So the word like implicit, explicit is something that we use a lot of times. So when you sort of what we want to do, and especially with these motor skills and situational awareness, we want to embed that to become so implicit, it's so ingrained, it's stored so deep in your brain that it is part of that muscle memory. It's something that it's automatic now. Whatever situation you are in, you're able to call up these skills in a way that's just fast, fluid, effective. And the only way that's going to happen is if that information and the skills and the procedures are really embedded and ingrained in your brain, in the memory parts of your brain, to become implicit. But in the initial stages of learning, you're first introduced to a concept. you kind of have to think about it. You really have to consciously, effortfully think and piece them together. So that's an explicit process. Like we have to really try, and it's still kind of and literally it's in the outer levels of your brain, the thinking parts that use a lot of energy and power to really to try to think about things in a more conscious, deliberate way. But that takes time. There's also no time in high pressure situations to be able to do that and to run through, well, what should I do now? And if that doesn't work, what else should I do? No, you have to rely on that implicit information to be able to act fast and act effectively. So that's also why we're so committed, and as you are as well. I'm really happy to hear that we're committed to these pedagogical practices, these training practices that are going to build that implicit, expert, automatic level of knowledge and understanding, because then when the stress gets high, that's all the information that is available to you. Your frontal cortex, the parts of your brain that are involved in all of that thinking, they're literally not accessible. They are not, they're shut down during fight or flight. You're not thinking about anything but where do I go? Where do I hide? How do I stop the threat that's immediately in front of me? That's all you can think about. And you're not even thinking, like you're just sort of reacting. And the terms that we want to move away from is we don't want officers to react based on, just an instinct, but we want them to be able to act effectively based on all of this implicit knowledge, based on your training and based on your skills and best practices, so that you're not, potentially doing something either that's wrong or making a mistake, or possibly even these, near misses where the end result might be good, but you did so using strategies that could have put yourself or your partner or someone else in danger along the way. So it's really important to, in training, not only to consider what the end was and outcome. Okay, yep, you did it, you made the right shoot decision, but you messed up in many parts along the way, or they had some sort of unconscious thought process that the trainer doesn't then stop and say, okay, well, why did you do this? And why did you do that? And what was that based on? It might actually reveal, well, this person is now encoding a really improper strategy, or really like potentially dangerous strategy to arrive at the proper end result. That's definitely not what we want either, because then in a different situation, they might think, well, what I did, steps A, B, and C took me to the right outcome, but they're now putting themselves in a position where they could get hurt, or make a mistake, or get a physical or psychological injury from a strategy that wasn't the best.
And is one of the keys to avoiding that, and you mentioned this before, so I just want to make sure that I'm clear on it, is because you're right. That's what we don't want. Like I always say context is king. The context of every situation. So that's back to situational awareness. Did you correctly assess the context that you're in? Because that's going to drive all that performance after that. So we don't want just that linear stimulus response type of behavior. So is more variability, the more that we can introduce in our drills and our training, the variability of context that the performer has to learn in, is that going to help reduce those training scars?
Absolutely. So not just the method itself, like having the scenarios that, again, we talked about, like they take a lot of time, and if you want to run officers through them individually, that will take, hundreds of hours if you've got a big service to get everyone through these dynamic scenarios. So capitalizing on some of those other approaches, like box drills or observational tasks, showing in a group setting so that officers also learn from each other, and hey, okay, yeah, he said this, that might actually be a good thing to do. That all helps to form these memories and get this information encoded, because you might then be on a call and remember, oh, I remember this guy in that training said that he actually checked behind that door before going in, or there was someone there that he didn't think. And it just gives you that one piece of information that could literally make the difference between you, like life or death. Like no other occupation has like life or death level situation decision making implications of something going wrong, or at least like, getting very, very seriously physically injured. So I can appreciate that the stakes are high. This isn't just like oh, do I fill this report in or not? Like the research and the training approaches that we focus on are for these life or death decision making. And the level of stress that you feel is life or death stress. It's not just, pressure or anxiety or whatever. Like this is really the highest level that you need to be expected to perform under. So that's not to say that you need to introduce that level of stress in a training context, but by building a repertoire, so building a set of experiences in the officer's mind that they've either run through themselves in scenarios that are stressful, obviously try to, have that as much as possible because it's immersive. There's physical cues, distance cues, and things that you need to be able to calculate. But then also using other approaches to then supplement that to just build kind of a sort of a catalog. Like when we say repertoire, really you're just building a catalog of experiences and information in the officer's brain that they can then use to, identify patterns and identify cues in other situations in the future. That just gives you more to build off of and know what to do or remember hearing a story of what another officer did, because that's another really important approach in policing, especially, and not just in learning but also in a therapeutic setting. This idea of narrating and creating a narrative and storytelling and hearing, some of these can be sometimes very morbid and sad stories, but it's really important to use those also as learning opportunities to say, well, this is what happened, but this is what could have been done. Well, that's now information for another officer that they can take with them and can be just as effective and memorable and something that sticks implicitly somewhere in the unconscious back part of your brain, that when you're in a similar situation, it's like, oh, okay, I'll remember that. I can kind of remember what happened there, and you can learn from that as well.
The ability to rapidly assess a situation, so your ability, for your visual motor behavior, your perception, your assessment, your understanding of what the situation is. Have you seen, because one of the things I've often seen like high performing teams use, not just in law enforcement, but even in other domains, is like what they call rapid decision making drills. And we sometimes refer to them as hood drills in law enforcement. And that just simply means that all of a sudden you're just quickly presented with a short snapshot of a scene, and then it's occluded and you have to, what did you see? What are you doing? What's critical? Has there been research on that type of training as it relates to what you're talking about?
I wish there was, and maybe that could be something for the future for me to explore. But that's what I was referring to as the box drills, or that's what I've heard them called or experienced them in that sense. But again, they're really important learning opportunities to train something very specific. So depending on whatever your learning objective is as a trainer, do you want to train these visual motor behaviors? You're trying to train the officers where to look. Are you trying to either train or assess? So this is another important differentiation. Like, are you training or evaluating? Because those are two different goals that with the evaluation piece introduces a level of stress or pressure, because the officer knows, well, I'm being evaluated. I know my performance, and if I screw up right now, it has implications. I might be, I might not qualify for duty. I might be stuck to a desk, or I might just look like an idiot in front of my instructor. So that adds pressure, that adds stress that we know influences performance. So a lot of these combined like training and evaluation contexts, again, in a perfect world, you would have separate training days and separate evaluation days, but we know that that's not the case. But that's something that we try to advocate for, at least recommend in our all of our research, showing like, hey, we know that that's going to introduce stress that might interfere with, definitely with performance and definitely with learning. So they shouldn't really be combined. So just kind of going back to your question though, these sort of hood drills, for the purpose, for their intended purpose, they're really effective. But if you were to try to assess, or for an annual requalification, you wanted to assess an officer's verbal de-escalation skills, and putting them in this sort of a hood drill where it's just a video screen or something like that, and they have only a second to respond. Well, they're not interacting with a live person. They're not really getting realistic physical social cues from a person. So it doesn't actually match your training or evaluation objective. So something else that, again, we've spoken to in other works and other research is the importance of really matching what is your objective as an instructor and as a trainer. What are the competencies and skills that you're trying to elicit or derive or observe? Even if they're unconscious processes like situational awareness, you can't really see that. You see the end result, you see the end behavior, but how do you actually elicit these unconscious processes? And through your feedback, through your debriefing with the officer, you want to get an understanding of, okay, why did you do what you did? There are different methods that would suit that, better or worse. So that in terms of the pedagogy, and your actual educational approach and the methods that you're using, it's really important to consider that. And it's not common that police trainers have pedagogical training or experience, and even in academia, like professors don't often have training on how to be good instructors and teachers. I've had so many crummy professors that don't know how to communicate, don't know how to articulate, but they're experts in their fields. They know what to do and how to do it. So even, we see in police instructors a lot, like operationally, they're the top of the top, they're very competent, but in making that explicit and verbalizing and languaging that implicit knowledge, something that they just know. I don't even know how I know this, but I just know it, that this is the way that it's supposed to be done. Uh, but that's not really effective from an instructor perspective. So that's why I'm really glad to be part of this series. And it's amazing that you're putting this together. I think it's an incredible asset and tool for instructors so that they can get to that next level and use approaches and tasks that are specifically suited to different learning objectives or different evaluation objectives. And consideration of that alone is really, really important.
Okay. Do you mind putting up that picture of the stress curve that you had there again? I have one more question.
Sure.
I really appreciate your time, and I know we're coming up on an hour, but I just have one more question. I think this will be really important for officers. So if you could share that. Okay.
Yeah.
So when I look at this, so correct me if I've misunderstood what you've said. So that middle area of that curve, like I see that as the sweet spot for motor learning. So if I can keep my performer in a level of moderate stress arousal, that their learning, their memory, the retention, the transfer of those skills is going to be optimal. But I've got to be careful, because if I push them off the other side into that more extreme stress side, you said learning is impaired. We can actually end up with stress injuries, training scars, all kinds of things, which are really bad. So as a trainer, Paula, how do I, when I'm doing drills and scenarios with my students, what would be indicators that they're in the optimal zone? Because I'm not measuring cortisol and heart rate variability and antithrombin and all that. So what would the average trainer look for visually to know that they've still got their students in that moderate optimal zone?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure that I have the training experience to give you that answer. I know Chief Inspector Hufta would know exactly what to do and exactly what to look for. So based on what I've learned from him, maybe some of the visual cues might be like, just notice how the student is breathing. Like, are they breathing? Are they kind of short of breath? Like, what's their expression like? Are they kind of blank? Are they there? Are they really looking at you, or just kind of looking through you and running through their own mind, especially if they've made a mistake? That's a really clear time when you have to try to bring them down first. So even just through different breathing techniques. So we train something called the one breath reset. So it's literally just inhaling, kind of pausing for a second, and then just breathing out through pursed lips. So that literally physically drives your heart rate down. So bringing you, kind of slingshotting you back, even just for that second, back into a more moderate optimal level of stress. It's something that we also train officers to do when they're in a scenario or when they're out in the field, to self-regulate themselves. Like if you feel, you physically feel what it's like to start getting into that red line and things start kind of getting hectic and crazy, you do this reset breath to drive your fight or flight reaction down, drive down your sympathetic arousal, your heart rate, all of that, just to give you that clearer mind, access your best training practices, get a little bit of situational awareness in the moment. And we know that it works. We know we've tested this training paradigm out, and we see reduced lethal force errors. We see improved physical recovery from stress. So in the time that it takes you then to recover from this extreme amount of stress, the officers can be elevated for the whole rest of the day, and just through training, not even, following calls. And with that repeated exposure, that has an incredible wear and tear on your physical and mental health. So some of those strategies, like literally just breathing, is going to help bring that officer back to that moderate optimal stress. And that's when you can do your debrief. That's when you can give your feedback, because otherwise they're not even hearing you. They're not listening to you. Your debrief is not being mentally encoded at all. They're just kind of focusing on maybe what went wrong, or just the arousal of the situation itself is kind of stressful. So bringing your student or your officer back to a level where they're receptive to the learning, where they're open to it, is really, really critical to do that.
Okay, that's excellent. And I guess we should just reinforce that at the other end of the curve, having a completely flat emotional, like having no stress arousal, that is also not leading to good learning, is it? So if we're, and I think, does student motivation tie into this? Because I'll often read the importance of student motivation and the relationship to learning. And for me, I think of my training, whether that's been firearms training or combatives martial arts, is I remember those moments when I had like that physiological arousal where I felt I was in that zone for learning. But I've also had those times where I have just been completely disengaged and unmotivated, and the learning has been absolutely horrible for me. So, there is a relationship there as well on that end, isn't there?
Absolutely. And if you don't have motivation, if you don't have engagement, again, these are all different words, but translate to some sort of physiological reaction. If you're completely disengaged, and I've seen it with undergraduates, they're not there, they're not listening, nothing's going in, nothing is being captured in the brain. Learning isn't happening. So in our training practices, it's so critical that we have the input from practitioners, from trainees that understand this relationship between motivation and engagement, and also the buy-in. Like me as a scientist, an academic, a non-police officer, an officer might think, oh, what, she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's never done this before. But just some small things like using the right terminology, showing that I have an understanding of, the operational realities of what police work is. I've worked really hard to try to do that in order to gain the buy-in, in order to gain that understanding and that perspective, so that even the officers that I've trained in the past, they say, okay, well, she gets it. Or, having the experienced trainers and officers next to us, they can connect with them in a way that the learning sticks, the motivation is there, because we're saying things and showing that we understand these relationships and the operational realities of it is really, really critical to getting that buy-in. So we're almost calling it buy-in, but that's immediately linked to, again, the level of motivation and engagement, and hopefully wanting to improve their skills, wanting to learn and train, which thankfully is something that officers don't have a shortage of. Like you're very a motivated group of professionals that always want to be better and want to strive to be better. It's not often that we see officers that aren't engaged, unless it's cases like this where it's like, oh, this is just another training exercise, another PowerPoint presentation. That's why we really want to introduce these different types of training exercises that, again, increase the complexity, increase the arousal, engagement, the realism, incorporate different elements like eye tracking and that kind of gadgetry that seems to really grab people's interest, but now teach officers that this is a really useful tool. This is uncovering unconscious, implicit, automatic behaviors that we can learn from, and you can directly implement into your training and build that expertise faster.
That's fantastic. Well, Dr. Di Nota, we've been going for an hour. I can't believe it's gone already.
I know.
There's so much I wanted to get into, but that just means we're going to have you back.
Not a
But
problem.
I'm going to give you the opportunity here, Doctor. Is there anything that you wished I would have asked you that you wanted to talk about?
I think we touched on the most novel and exciting stuff that I really wanted to convey. So so the research that we've done on situational awareness, answering some of those unanswered questions in the 2019 paper of needing definitions, needing operational, concrete, police-specific definitions for some of these concepts. I'm really proud of the research that I've been able to do and collaborate with Juha Matti in Finland to answer some of these questions and really contribute meaningfully to the issue in policing that you mentioned right from the beginning, that there's still a lack of a professional standard, like across the board, across the globe. Law enforcement and policing is, fundamentally it serves a similar function, and there need to be better standards. I think even the police can agree to that. Like, why is one service doing something than another in another jurisdiction, and that potentially puts the operators, the officers, at a disadvantage and compromises your professional safety. So the same way that we train surgeons and other people that are responsible for life or death decisions, I'm really committed to helping to promote the training standards and the professional standards for police that equips the people, the law enforcement officers that we trust to serve and protect our communities, to have the same level of training and preparedness, not only for public safety, but for their own operational safety and wellness and health as well. Like, looking at it really holistically. So maybe next time we can talk more about some of the other health and wellness initiatives, or the actual breathing techniques and training that we offer to help regulate stress, that again not only has a performance benefit but also has these other general wellness and physical resilience benefits as well.
That's fantastic, and I am excited to have you and your. Please pronounce his name for me again. Your peer.
So coincidentally, my mother is Finnish, so I have the benefit of pronouncing his name properly. But Juha Matti, or Julle as he's affectionately known. So I'm now promising him to be on the series, and I consulted with him yesterday with your list of questions, saying, "Oh my God, they're asking about this paper that we wrote, feels like decades ago." So we already had a run through, and I'm gonna convince him to find a time with the time difference to zoom in with us from Finland. But he's been a very generous and gracious mentor and instructor to me as well, and I know he's happy to answer questions. I think you can find both of our emails on the research articles and things like that to reach out with any questions or copies of these articles and things. We're always happy to engage.
Okay, well, we will want to have both of you on to talk about what they're doing in Finland, because again, the whole goal of Trainers Bullpen is applied research. So it's going to be awesome to hear him talk about how they're applying all of this in Finland. And I want to also have you back on to talk about iPrep and how you're using the iPrep to help officers with regulation and physiological arousal and performance. So we have a lot to look forward to for the future. But I want to thank you, Doctor, for what you do and for making the time to be on the Trainers Bullpen today.
Happy to be here. Thank you so much, Chris.